So I want to begin today with this map on the left-hand side, which depicts in purple the Lake Okeechobee watershed, and this yellowish orangish color is the St. Lucie River watershed, and then this greenish color is the Coosawhatchee River watershed. So why do we need to do rulemaking? Well, specifically, the Florida statutes require that the district revise the 40E-61 rules for Lake Okeechobee and that we develop new rules for the river watersheds. You may be wondering, well, why is the legislature requiring that? Well, on this slide I have graphs of each of the three watersheds that make up the Northern Everglades watersheds. The Florida Department of Environmental Protection has determined that these three watersheds have impaired water bodies, and they have worked to develop something called Total Maximum Daily Loads, or TMDLs, which are the restoration goals that they've set for each of the watersheds. On the right-hand side of these graphs, I have the current water quality conditions. And as you can see, there is a difference between where we need to be and where we are, which explains why restoration is necessary. So now, on this slide, I'd kind of like to walk through with you the history of the restoration efforts within these areas. It all began in 1987 with something called the Surface Water Improvement and Management Act. And there was a piece of that legislation, it had a specific number, 373.4595, that related specifically to Lake Okeechobee, and it's what the existing rules were based upon. That same piece of legislation today is known as the Northern Everglades and Estuarine Protection Program, or the NEP. But from where it was back then to where it is today, there were a lot of changes along the way, some of which I've listed on this slide. I'm not going to go through every one, but there are a few things that I do want to highlight on this slide. There is a second statute, and that's 403-067. This particular statute governs how DEP determines that water bodies are impaired. So, governs how they establish total maximum daily loads. And in 2005, that particular statute was amended to say that DEP could use Basin Management Action Plans, or BMAPs, as the plans for restoration. It said they could use it, but they didn't necessarily have to. Then in 2007, that other statute that I was talking about, the 373.4595, that was amended. And that was the year that the river watersheds were added, and that statute was renamed the Northern Everglades and Estuarine Protection Program. Between 2012 and 2014, DEP did develop basin management action plans for the three Northern Everglades watersheds. In 2016, we had a lot of changes. In 2016, that is when the NEP was amended to say that BMAPs are now required for the three Northern Everglades watersheds. So now DEP must develop BMAPs for those watersheds. That was also when the district was told to revise 40E-61. And because of the statutory changes, the underlying authorities for the existing rules have changed, making them obsolete. So the district pretty much has to start from scratch. The other thing that happened in 2016 was the coordinating agency roles were redefined. And the coordinating agencies are the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, and the South Florida Water Management District. And my next slide goes into a little bit what those roles are. So DEP has the lead on water quality through its basin management action plans. DAX has the lead on agricultural BMPs, and the district is responsible for watershed protection plans, and we're the lead on hydrologic improvements. And our watershed protection plans consist of the Research and Water Quality Monitoring Program and the watershed construction projects. And 40E-61 is a program under the protection plans. So now you kind of know where these rules fit into the big picture. So The next thing to look at is, well, what did the 2016 NEAP state that the district needs to do with these rules? And we kind of covered the first two bullets, which were we have to revise the rules for Lake Okeechobee and we have to make new rules for the rivers. The statute also says that these rules must be consistent with the NEAP statute itself and with 403.067. And remember, that's that statute that covers basin management action plans. The statute also says that the district must provide for a monitoring program for those not implementing best management practices, either through DACs for ag, or through, or if they're not implementing best management practices through DEP for non-ag. So we have to have rules stating how those folks would monitor. The NEAP also requires a research and water quality monitoring program. So now this slide zooms into one of the current inconsistencies. The existing rule boundary is this area here outlined in purple. And the map on the right has that same area outlined, superimposed over the NEAP boundary, which is in green. So as you can see, in order to be consistent, we have to expand the Lake Okeechobee boundary, and of course we have to go into the river watersheds. Now I'd like to step back and give you a few thoughts before we go into the draft concepts. But I first want to address the issue of rule text. We received a lot of feedback at our governing board presentation in October. There was disappointment that we didn't come out with rule text. And we wanted to let you know what the staff was thinking. This area is quite large. It's about 5 million acres. And it's also quite diverse. We have very urban areas, and we also have some very rural areas. And staff felt that if we came out with rules, maybe we would address, have rules that would work for 60% of the constituents, but maybe the remaining 40%, it may represent a severe hardship or not be practical. So we wanted to bring our draft concepts out and get feedback before we came out with rule text. There will be opportunity for you to comment on rule text in the future, because after we finish conducting our workshops, we're going to go back, we're going to draft some rules, and then we're going to come out and do a whole nother set of workshops in the same locations that we have done for this first round. So some things that we want to consider as we're looking at drafting the rules is, what do the statutes direct us to do? We want to look at current water quality conditions. We want to try to avoid duplication with other regulatory programs. And as I mentioned, we have a conceptual framework we'll be presenting today. And we definitely want stakeholder input, because we want to make sure that the rules are reasonable and practical and don't cause any unintended consequences. So with that, we'll jump into the overall draft concept, which has 3 components. The first component is a monitoring component, which consists of 2 parts. The first part would be to have the requirements for those entities that are not implementing BMPs, either through DACs or DEP. So we need to have those requirements developed. The second part of the monitoring component consists of looking at existing monitoring. And on this slide, I have a map of the district's monitoring network, both the current and the proposed, and some of the handouts that we provided were the current and proposed district monitoring. We did get feedback at our Okeechobee workshop. There was concern that there may be some areas that were not monitored, and at that point we did mention that there is also monitoring done by other entities that DEP has in its watershed information network. And when we're done with the workshop, you can come look at this map over here, where we have the monitoring that was provided to us by DEP. That is their nutrient monitoring locations that are in their watershed information network. Just please be aware that while DEP is looking at this for determining their sites in their VMAP, they're not necessarily using every single one. Also, some of the monitoring that the district has is on this map, but not all. So just keep that in mind when you review that map. But back to our presentation. So once we establish a monitoring network, we could use that to represent contributing or nutrient levels from contributing areas. We could use the data from that network to support research efforts, to evaluate nutrient reduction technologies, and to evaluate projects that we've implemented. The coordinating agencies could also use that information to make informed decisions on where projects need to go. So we were thinking the rules also could establish methods to assess this data to track our progress, and that we could then define what would trigger an action and what those actions would be within the rule. And I'm going to get more into each of these concepts, but before I do that, I do want to step back a little bit again and mention that, you know, as we give ideas at the end, when we're talking amongst everyone, we need to remember that ideas that we have may work really well for some constituents, but they could cause a severe hardship for others. So we have to find a balance. We want to have rules that are reasonable and implementable. As I said, we don't want to have any unintended consequences. And we always have to compare the ideas we get against what the district has the statutory authority for. So let's go further into the concepts. The first part being the monitoring concept that is for monitoring in lieu of BMPs. In other words, for those entities that are not implementing BMPs, what kind of requirements could these rules have? Whatever we do have, it will have to be consistent with DEP's statewide rule. DEP does have a statewide rule regarding this matter, and I believe we had handouts of that. I hope we had enough left. Okay, good. We had handouts of that for you to pick up today. But we could be more specific than DEP's rule, and I listed a couple things that we could maybe specify more. But another thing that we're going to have to consider is we need to make sure that the rules are practical, because we've also heard a lot of comments at our boards about the difficulties of monitoring within the Northern Everglades. So we can't have a requirement that isn't practical for someone to implement. And during our public comment period at the end, you may have other ideas that you would like to share with us. So the second part of the monitoring component was, again, looking at the established monitoring networks and reviewing proposed monitoring networks. As I said, this slide kind of focuses on the district's monitoring network, and we have both basin level and upstream level, and I will explain what those mean. Oops, if I can get the right button here. Okay. The basin levels are the red squares, and basically those are monitoring where we have measurements of flow and concentration so we can calculate loads. So for example, here's the Fishing Creek Basin. So we have a monitoring site over here that gives us our load information for Fishing Creek. And then upstream of that site, within that basin, we have what we call our upstream monitoring sites. These are typically just concentration sites. And the green are the ones that are existing. The yellow are the ones that are proposed. We are also proposing on expanding our number of parameters that we're monitoring. We're going to have speciation, so that will also help to target the proper projects for the proper locations. And as I mentioned earlier, a little bit earlier, you know, there are some sites that we might also want to look at that are in the watershed information network. So after we have established where we're going to look at monitoring for these rules, we then need to determine, well, how are we going to assess the data from this network? We probably want to look to see if there are already existing long-term trends, and we would want to identify the types of statistical tests that we're going to use. Are we going to use averages? Are we going to look at trends? The other thing we might want to consider is looking at a combination of factors. There are areas within these watersheds where there are decreasing trends. However, those same areas have very high, what we would call unit area loads, which is basically, if you take the load from that area and divide it by the acreage, that gives you a pound per acre. And you can compare that to other areas of the watershed. So while the loads or concentrations may be decreasing, if the unit area load is very high, you may still want to do something in that area. So that's something we need to consider. And again, there may be other ideas that we can consider as well. So, okay, We've established our network, we've assessed our data, and we've determined that we need to have some sort of action. And I've laid out some actions here, and I'm sure there are many others that we can consider. But of course, the first thing would be to communicate our findings to our coordinating agency partners, DAX and DEP, and they may reevaluate the BMPs that they're implementing in a particular area. It will be helpful now that we have the speciation, because we can determine, well, hey, you know, there's a lot of particulate phosphorus in this area, and maybe they can, you know, have their entities implement more sediment controls. Another action that might be triggered, we might need to do additional water quality investigations. We might need to look at what's in the wind network, or we might not have enough, it was mentioned earlier today, we might not have enough flow monitoring in a particular area. You know, if it's our upstream sites, we don't have flow at all of those stations. It's very expensive to do flow monitoring, but maybe if we see an area within the watershed that is having a problem, that might be something that we might need to do in that area. We also might need to implement additional regional projects, such as the Lakeside Ranch stormwater treatment area. And then another idea might be to implement some type of improved water management systems. We also brought along with us today brochures from Southwest Florida. They have something called a Farms program, where they cost share things like such as tailwater recovery programs. So that might be something that get triggered. And again, there might be lots of other ideas that you have to share with us. So that's pretty much the concept as a whole. But before we get to the question and answer session, I want to kind of show you where we are on our timeline. We are at the top bar. We are conducting our workshops with the concepts. And we have one more workshop tomorrow, and then our first round of workshops will be done, and we will be busily drafting little text, and we hope to come back out the end of January to, as I said, these same 5 locations and present the draft rule text and get feedback on that. This just shows, again, our workshop schedule. Like I said, we've got one more tomorrow. And how can you stay involved? First of all, we really want to thank you for coming today. You can give us comments during our public comment period. We're also going to stick around afterwards so you can talk to us individually if you'd like. We also have a website where you can go and you can leave comments on our website. We also take handwritten comments if you want to give them to us. I was asked, when do you need to comment by? And I asked for comments by November 30th because we're going to try to start drafting the rules in December, but if that's a little tight because this meeting was a little later than some of the earlier ones, if you could just get us to us sometime in December, that would really be appreciated so we can incorporate your comments into our draft rules. And with that, we will open it up for public questions and comments. We have a microphone here. We would ask that you please come up and state your name and who you're representing, and we'll take comments and questions.
I just wanted to say, last night I spent over 8 years of work with a group, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and all the refuge managers, whole state, Panther, Merritt Island, and also the National Wildlife Refuge Association and FWC. And they're working on, and we've been working on, financing, funding, and buying easements for a new 150,000 acre national wildlife refuge. Are you aware of that refuge that is included in that map?
No, I'm sorry to say that I'm not particularly personally aware of it, but I'd be happy to learn about it if you would speak to me after.
The refuge. Yeah, I get the mic. Okay. Now I have to get the mic out. When you say it, I'll get it. The refuge is a big project.
Okay.
You've now been watching twice, trying to get it. How this can be going on, and you guys are not talking to each other, is amazing. So I'm going to give you a name of the guy who's the head of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And name is Bill Miller.
Okay,
Recorded here. He's the Everglades Headwater National Wildlife Refuge kind of guru. And if you go on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and look it up, or you know someone there, they'll know. They are acquiring conservation easements and buying property right in this map.
okay,
Most of it's in the Kissimmee River system. So if you're doing what you're doing, and they're doing what they're doing, the two shall probably be talking to each other.
okay, we will definitely look him up.
It is a very big deal in what you're doing here. The ranches and everything they're dealing with, you're going to be dealing with.
Okay. Thank you for that comment.
Roxanne Chester with City of Port St. Lucie. Will the PowerPoint presentation be available for us?
Yes, we are going to put it on the website, and actually, the one from November 5th, which is almost identical, is already on the website.
Okay, great.
Hi, my name is Gary Goforth. I'm with the Florida Oceanographic Society Board of Directors. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. I am absolutely underwhelmed with the lack of environmental protection that you're proposing. I see no actions that you describe that will actually reduce the pollution going into Lake Okeechobee. I see no actions that you're proposing that will reduce the pollution going into either estuary. I know this is not a personal comment directed at you, Stephanie, or your other fine staff, but just in terms of your overall objectives. By contrast, let's go to the existing 40E-61 program. The Water Management District issued almost 1,000, let's say 750 permits back in 1989 to 92 timeframe. Today, on the books, you have over 750 active 40E-61 permits. These permits are issued to individual landowners. These permits have specific numeric phosphorus concentration limits. These permits have a very well thought out, reasonable program for working with the landowner. If there is a compliance issue, say the landowner's permit, say a calf operation, typically an improved pasture, if I remember specifically, it's about 350 parts per billion phosphorus. In the past, as your staff would go out in the early 1990s, and I see consultants to the ag industry that used to be on your staff and write these permits. There was this very reasonable approach to work with the landowner to try to resolve water quality problems. And indeed, ditches were plugged, new BMPs were implemented. And it was because of a very good regulatory program, the 40E-61 program. And that program has been maintained over the years. I'm sorry to say that just by looking at the Water Management District data, it's very obvious that y'all are doing self-policing of your permits. You're collecting data directly downstream of individual landowners' parcels that are upwards of twice the discharge limit that is contained in your own permits. So it's disappointing to see that over the years, the Water Management District has weakened its effect to try to really restore Lake Okeechobee water quality and the estuaries. And I don't think this is a fault of staff. I think you are, as your opening slide pointed out, you're trying to be consistent with what the legislature has directed you to do. And the legislature has consistently, since certainly 2013 timeframe, they consistently weakened the environmental protection in the state of Florida. I think I just had really high expectations that the Water Management District continued its efforts to have an effective regulatory program that set specifically the numeric discharge limits so landowners would know what their restoration goals are and provide a very reasonable method to work with the landowners to identify where the problems are, identify ways to resolve the problem, work with the landowner, and only in very rare examples have to take any type of enforcement action. But it's just disappointing. In 2013, the Water Management District, at the request of the 2007 legislature, began revising 4061, and I was very fortunate. You hired my company and others to develop the technical support documents, and we've spent, I think, 3 years and developed probably the most comprehensive water quality hydrology analyses of like the Petroleum watershed and the estuaries. And we provided performance metrics that the Water Management District could use on an annual basis using real data, not computer simulated data of best case scenario, which is what the state of Florida was doing with the PMAPs, but real data and providing real effective feedback to the landowners, identifying areas that they need to improve on. And so my very first comment would be, please use those 2013 technical support documents as a foundation for your revisions to 4061. Obviously, certain things have changed. To be consistent with the map, you might have to go back and look at some of the time frames that we used. But in terms of the methodologies that were developed, they mirrored the approach used in 4063, which is an excellent example of a regulatory program. There are differences between north and south, don't get me wrong. Those can be overcome. Your 4061 permits that you issued in 1989, and I'll cede the microphone in a minute, but even those permits identified discharge locations and sampling sites for all of those permits. And so now to hear consultants and lobbyists say, oh, you can't put monitoring stations on these sites, it's impossible. You guys have already solved that problem. So anyway, my first comment is use those 2013 technical support documents as a foundation for revisions, and I look forward to continuing providing comments as we can. I'll see the microphone for now.
Thank you for your comment.
Just as a follow-up to that, as you know, 2016, the strategy changed as a result of legislative directive for Northern Everglades and estuaries protection specifically. So we have passed the baton to DEP and DACs for the ag BMPs and source controls. But we're a big part, of supporting that as a coordinating agency. But those technical support documents have also been passed to DEP to help them to support their activities related to.
So you're saying they're going to develop a regulatory program that will hold landowners accountable?
The BMAP has a regulatory component. So that's the regulatory program that is, the BMAP is enforceable for ag and non-ag BMPs and for other things, projects. So, any other questions?
Mary Matheson, City of Stuart Commissioner. I guess a couple weeks ago I sat in on the DEP's BMAP revision, and there was some questions on how the monitoring was actually taken, if there was consistencies in incoming tide, outgoing tide, what the weather was. And my takeaway was that the people giving the lecture didn't actually know how it was taken, and they kind of referred it back over to the district for some of the sites in the basin area here. I guess I'm wondering, how often do you guys communicate, and what's that communication like? Because it seems to be an issue.
We're literally on the phone weekly with DEP communicating about monitoring sites and the status of new sites, existing sites, They're in the process of expanding their monitoring network and updating them for each of the maps. So we're out in the field several times a month scouting some of these sites. And the sites that we are considering have to meet certain criteria. And we can give you information on that if you'd like, to make sure that they're representative of areas that are flowing from the watershed to those sites, to make sure that they're accessible sites. We want to try to get to sites that we can get data from at least on a monthly frequency. But for our district sites, we're actually visiting those twice a month. So there's a lot going on as far as making sure we're getting good monitoring sites, representative runoff. DEP doesn't use all of our sites. They select from a huge pool of monitoring by the district and other entities to put into their BMAP. So that's something that they do with their own criteria. But we're a big part of that team that helps to create the monitoring networks for the BMAPs.
So DEP was just getting the data.
So the Roosevelt Bridge came up, and it sounded like DP was taking your data, but they had no idea how, when, the frequency of anything, how the data was collected. Would they were kind of refer us, to the district. I guess, have you spoken with the GP about what Dr. Goforth was referring to, that his company did? They're aware and have that information.
Yes, they're very aware of that. They've got the deliverables, the documents that were as a result of that effort.
Any chance you know if they're aware of the potential upcoming national wildlife refuge?
They're aware of it, and the district's aware of it too. We're communicating regularly with them too. Was your concern about that particular site and how the data was collected, or just that we're communicating with DP about the monitoring?
I guess the overall concern was
It's the communication. The question was wondering what the frequency was at the Roosevelt Bridge, whether it was done just to average out over the year, or whether there was an attempt to be made on incoming tide, outgoing tide, or other weather patterns.
We happen to have our St. Lucie watershed monitoring expert right here with us. So I'll turn it over to Jody Hutchins to answer your question.
Hi, good evening. Jody Hutchins, and I was actually in attendance to the meeting that you're referencing. So that site that you're questioning is the site at the Roosevelt Bridge, and that is a long-term monitoring station that the district has, and it is a grab sample that's collected bi-weekly. So that information is reported by the district and the South Florida Environmental Report. And it's just a straight average. It's not, there isn't any filtering, to my understanding, related to tidal effects or incoming, outcoming tide. And the way DEP had presented that information at the BMAP update meeting was, it seemed more of an idea of how the BMAP can be assessed in the future, and they were just giving some examples, and that was the site that they were suggesting can be used to determine whether or not the BMAP is on track or is not on track. And yes, when the questions came up about, okay, well, what is the data actually showing? They weren't really prepared for those types of questions. But that is something that we could assist with them and give them the information needed to better answer their questions.
Right now, the major focus really is in getting monitoring networks set up to have the right data in the right places. So DEP is still trying to develop methods for measuring performance, how soon, how quickly can we get to the TMDL. So they're in the process of trying to establish those methods. So, but as far as our data and how we present it, we're just presenting the data, not so much methods for determining performance. That's what DEP's role, and that's what they've been working on most recently.
I'd say that I'm pretty good, but, so the district's mostly gonna be collecting the data and handing it to DEP. They're gonna be the ones going forward from 2016 in charge of enforcement. Is that correct? Mhm. But would you say the majority of the data collection is still done by the district? Or is that?
On this map, that's all district monitoring.
Mhm.
DEP does use data from other county sites.
Uh-huh.
So, and they identify the data with who's collecting at each site.
Mhm.
I do think the majority of data is district.
That's what I gathered from, okay, thank you. I think that's-
And as you know, our data goes through a rigorous quality assurance process. So,
Gary Ritter with the Florida Farm Bureau Federation. This is just more of a comment, and I know I don't want to get into a debate with Dr. Goforth here, but I was the supervisor of the Works of the District program in 1989. And during that time, the challenges that we had was the fact that, yes, we were able to get roughly 700 to 800 permits, but it was mostly an administrative effort at that time, just due to resources. The water quality monitoring network that was out there was actually already in place, and yes, it was providing a great deal of good information. One of the criticisms of that program was the fact that we had staff that was really good at issuing permits, but we at the time kind of lacked the knowledge and expertise of helping landowners develop best management practices in a robust way. And many times with the water quality monitoring network, when we tried to evaluate those areas, yes, there was specific criteria that, you had to meet 350 parts per billion if you were a certain land use, and there, I don't remember what the other concentrations were, but the challenge was to how to identify and tweak out what was actually coming in off of those land uses, where it was coming from, and how much of it was residual, and how much of it was real time. And so as we went along with this program, yes, there was really never any enforcement cases, but it was also very difficult to go back in and verify, because of lack of resources, what landowners were actually doing in that watershed. So that was when the emphasis kind of changed over to FDACs and said, okay, here's an agency that's really good at developing best management practices because they're in the agricultural business, and here's the water management district that's really good at doing water quality monitoring. And, that appears to be now maybe coming together, hopefully, after all this time. But, again, the Works of the District program initially in its infancy was more of an administrative effort than it was actually getting PMPs on the ground. And I will say this, at that time, we were fortunate in the fact that many of the agricultural operations were implementing a certain level of BMPs. They were changing their fertilizer. Most of the cow-calf operations were already changing their fertilizer application rates. And And DEP actually had a rule, a regulatory rule, where they were changing the face of the dairy industry with the types of BMPs that they were putting in, like confinement barn in high-intensity area systems to capture runoff. So,
Thanks, Gary. You have been involved in this for a long time, so thanks for that history.
Feel free to get up and leave if you're tired of listening to me. The district's water quality monitoring is probably the finest in any agency I've ever been involved in. I've worked all around the country. You ought to be commended for how much technical expertise you have in how to collect the water sample and acknowledging incoming tide and outgoing tides. And your QA, QC is absolutely beyond impressive. Your staff are the most dedicated I've ever worked with, and I applaud you all for that. DP, not so much. DP is let me just give you an example. And what I'd like to know, I'm going to give you an example of how DEP is mismanaging the state's pollution control program. And I'd like you to give me a nod or yes or no whether your efforts are going to improve that. Let's look at the public health in the estuaries. 2016 and 2018, we had massive outbreak of toxic algae. We had one dog died. We had studies from University of Miami to Ohio State University that point out that the people that live in these estuary areas are living with twice the risk of death than average due to non-alcohol related liver activities, liver mortality. And that liver disease is a symptom of the toxin in the cyanobacteria, which is coming from Lake Okeechobee and moving into the estuaries. A major health crisis that we face. Y'all are aware of that. My focus, Newton's focus, has been you got to clean up Lake Okeechobee, or else you can continue killing the people around the estuaries. And the state has been negligent for decades. The state set a TMDL for the lake in 2001. It was to be achieved by 2015. The legislature, influenced by lobbyists from agriculture for 3 years in a row, finally passed the 2016 horrible law that absolutely struck out the deadline to achieve the Lake Okeechobee TMDL. Absolutely struck it out. Put this ambiguous effort called the BMAP, which has no hard deadline to achieve the TMDLs. In addition, the DEP, instead of following the TMDL, which says you have to use measured data to come up with your assessment on progress towards achieving the TMDL, thank God the district puts out that measured data, by the way. DEP ignores that. DEP uses a computer model that assumes all the ag BMPs are working to perfection, ignores issues such as biosolids applications, ignores the real data, and comes out with annual reports that say, gosh, things are doing well. The first report they came out, they said there was massive reductions in phosphorus loads to the lake. They didn't even put the caveat, the clarity that, oh, by the way, we're ignoring 800,000 acres of area that discharged in the lake. We're only going to look at what they call the northern watersheds. The discrepancy between what DEP put in their report and told the legislature, told the public, told the governor, told people who blog based on the results of their reports that things are great. The discrepancy between what the district put out and what what DEP put out, the real loads are about 28% higher than what DEP put in their annual progress report. After my commenting and the next year's report, they put the caveat. They said, oh yes, we're only going to show the computer simulated results for the northern episodes, the northern basins. That year, the discrepancy between what they put out and told the governor, told the legislature, told the public, and what the district showed was really entering the lake from those northern basins. So what did 40%? And it was the real data that the district collected and reported showed that the real phosphorus loading in the lake was 40% more than what the state of Florida was telling the public. This last year, actually the second year was 49%. This year, the difference was 40%. In other words, your data, water management district data, is showing that the district, the DEP, is misleading the government, misleading the legislature, misleading the public by 40%. And they're saying that lows are getting better. And the reality is, the 10-year average loading was, I think, about 14% worse last year than when DEP started the process. Things are getting worse. DEP is reporting that things are getting better. How will your effort correct that situation?
It's a tough one, Gary. But in response to the governor's executive order to fast track nutrient reduction measures and DEP having to update their basin management action plan for all 3 of these watersheds by early next year, our governing board a couple months ago approved an expanded monitoring network that is key to supporting those efforts, not only for DEP's BMAP updates, but also for the Blue Green Line Task Force. So I think DEP is trying to incorporate more of this measured data and using more of the measured data and science-based decision-making approaches. So if you get to the BMAP meetings recently, they've talked about using measured data and establishing benchmarks. So I think they're moving in that direction, and a big part of it is because we are expanding the monitoring networks and the data that's available, and they're trying to incorporate that now in the BMAP updates. So hopefully we're moving in the right direction with all of those steps. So this rule and the monitoring associated with that is in support of those BMAP efforts where they're trying to get more at measured data and decisions informed by measured data.
So it's yet to be seen whether they'll use the data.
I think they have been using the data. They use our data in different ways, but they're starting to use it.
Annual progress reports, as opposed to a computer simulation that is absolutely out of touch with reality.
But what they're trying to do now is to pick up the measured data that we're expanding our monitoring network for to help support that. So they are coming up with ideas for how to use measured data and establish benchmarks to trigger action based on prioritized areas that they have identified through measured data. So that's where they're headed with their strategies now.
As you know, Pam, in 2013, the technical support documents used existing monitoring network and provided the ability to use measured data on an annual basis and assess the performance, say, of C44 basin. We didn't need any upstream basin data to assess performance towards achieving TMDL. We could still do that. In fact, one of the, and I've given recommendations to DEP. I've actually talked to the governing board members on how to improve the BMAP of both the lake and the estuaries. One of them, for example, is the BMAP reduces all of their so-called information to a single value. And that was basically a load reduction for the entire Lake Okeechobee watershed, or load reduction for the entire St. Lucie watershed. Put aside that the number is 40 to 60% off, which is insane. Let's go to the issue of, if you don't look at basin by basin, now there's a TMDLs and the BMAPs were actually established by basin. In the St. Lucie watershed, there were 9 water bodies that had specific BMAP or TMDL load reductions identified. The Water Management District's data, even of 3 years ago, can and do provide information on whether those TMDLs are being achieved or not. The DEP has refused to use that information. And by consolidating their reporting to just show one number, you miss very important information. For example, you don't see the basin by basin performance. St. Lucie watershed, for example. C44 basin is poor, it's getting worse. The trend is going in the wrong direction. DEP's BMAP process absolutely masks that, doesn't see that, doesn't begin to understand how to solve a problem that they deny exists because they don't look at a basin by basin approach. So I simply don't believe the DEP now is suddenly gonna say, oh, now we have more data, we're gonna change everything we're doing, and now provide better assessment. What gives you the confidence that they're gonna use this data? I mean, for example, did they ask you to increase your monitoring network before you went to your governing board and asked for money to expand your network? Was that because DEP asked you for every one of those additional sites?
We were in discussions with them. We were definitely in discussions with them. I mean, we're constantly communicating with DEP and Department of Agriculture on monitoring needs, for example. Where are the gaps? Where do we need to be filling in the gaps? So it was definitely a process that included them. So I do appreciate the, your comments and your concerns. But they are moving more towards using measured data. I mean, in the processes that they're going through right now to update the maps. So maybe as that process starts, they get draft documents out. I think they're coming out in the next month or two. Maybe you'll see some differences that will make you feel better. Okay.
Hi, I'm Jackie Thurlow, Litvish, recently on the governing board, but many years sitting here just asking questions, so that's how I'm feeling mostly. Could you just qualify for me, Stephanie, in my simple notes, you were talking about, you said there were 3 things in the very beginning.
Oh, about the concept?
Yeah, and I heard you say, I think like the first one, I am always totally, feel like I am not on top of this when I come here for these kind of things. So there's monitoring, but then there's monitoring that they're already doing. I mean, can you just break it down easily for me to see a difference between each one, if you don't mind, if that's possible, what number 3 would be, please?
Okay, the 3 things I spoke of was the monitoring component, then there's assessment component. Oh, I'm on the wrong slide, sorry. That was here. Is that it?
So that's the 3 things?
Yes, there's the monitoring component, and those bullets are underneath the monitoring component. So basically, we have to do monitoring, but there's 2 parts to that, because we do have a part where we have to ask individuals that are not implementing BMPs to monitor. So that's one set of monitoring. So then there's monitoring that we want to take for the watershed as a whole and evaluate. So that's the second component. We're evaluating the monitoring that the district is doing in DEP, maybe some of those insights.
Can you say it again? Say the first one and the second one again.
Okay, first is monitoring.
What kind of monitoring? Which monitoring stations? What monitoring?
Okay, the monitoring component would have to have 2 parts. One part would deal with individuals not implementing BMPs.
So that would be at landowner property boundaries. So that's the.
I thought they were mandatory.
Only if, well, what the statute says is that you have to do monitoring if you're not implementing BMPs.
To show you're not contributing.
Thank you. Yes, to show you're not contributing. So we have to have that component because the 2016 statute specifically directs the district to have those type of rules. Okay.
So it's mandatory that they do something, either BMPs or monitoring. They've all so far elected to do the BMPs.
So that's the first one. And then, I'm sorry, again, the second.
Okay. Well, we also, within monitoring, also want to use the district's monitoring network. We want to use the data from that to define areas where we see that, nutrient levels are going up. Okay, so we would do some type of assessment. So that's really the second part. We would do an assessment on the district monitoring data.
That we already have.
That we have, yes.
And how many monitoring stations do we already have?
Okay, now I need to go to that other side.
Right,
It's
and-
47, there's 47.
I would just do totals. So in the Lake Okeechobee watershed, there's 137. Yeah, in the Lake Okeechobee watershed, there's 137.
Okay, there you go, 137. Let me go back.
137. So we're trying to look at different scales. So zooming in all the way into individuals, that would be the last thing that we would do. But we're starting out more of a zoomed out look at water quality, like looking at collective areas, like monitoring locations can represent certain areas because of the hydrologic area.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
For my mind,
Yeah.
let's just go, so the first, I understood the first one.
Okay.
Now the second one is the
Zooming out.
137 monitoring stations.
Yes.
We're gonna use that data.
Yes.
Meaning, we're gonna use that data, we're gonna give it to DEP. Is that what that means?
we already give it to DEP, but what we would use this rule for is to set up maybe statistical methods for analyzing the data to also indicate, is the data telling us something? Is it telling us that there's an upward trend or a downward trend, or that we might have an area that needs more attention because it's got much higher?
So, but I thought DEP did that.
They do it at the TMDL level, and they also do it, they're starting to look at this more zoomed in level, but up till now, they've only been looking at the sub-watershed level.
Could I simply say it, that it's making the monitoring a higher level, or better, or more strict? I don't know. I mean, is it, we were talking science talk, but in non-science talk, you know, what is it? It's like the district is showing the DEP how to interpret the data in a better, I hope, in a better way. Is that what we're doing? A different way, a more
different ways
complex
of
way?
different ways of looking at
Theirs
the
is
data.
simple, it's DMP maps. I don't know, you know what I'm saying? So in a,
DEP looks at things more from the big picture perspective. They're looking at what's going into the lake, what's happening within the lake. How close are we to meeting the total maximum daily loads that the lake needs to have a healthy ecosystem? The upstream monitoring is more of what the district is looking at, having ready for when the DEP decides which areas they think they need to go into as higher priorities. We'll have that data ready. We'll have statistical analysis methods ready to show where they might want to focus resources on. And,
okay, and they make that decision to take it, or it has to be like it's like this whole process just has to happen, and the legislature has to decide if they accept it too, but I mean, is it kind of everybody agreeing on it?
It's everyone's agreeing on it. It's a coordinated effort among the three agencies. When it comes though to enforcement for what DEP considers not improving or not improving fast enough or not improving enough, they're the ones that do enforcement for water quality progress. And they're coming up with methods for doing that right now.
Okay, and then that was the first thing and the second thing, right? So what's the third thing, please?
Those would be actions that could be taken, you know, after we've established where the monitoring is going to be and the rules have kind of established how we're going to assess them. We would have actions defined in the rule. One of which that I mentioned was communicating to DACS and DEP what our data is saying. Other types of actions could be, maybe that's where we need to implement additional regional projects like SCAs, or we might be able to do a cost share program for care water recovery, or it may trigger that we need additional monitoring because our upstream sites are concentration based, and we might determine that we need some additional flow monitoring in those areas.
So a big part.
Is there a synonym for action to take act? Does that just mean like an action item on an agenda, or does that mean something that we do?
Something that we do. So it may be that we
Trigger?
You're going to define
Trigger?
a trigger.
Yes.
So, and it may be that the trigger is we've prioritized some areas. And these higher priority areas may need to get at the top of the list for cost share funding. Because resources are so limited, we can't be everywhere doing everything and making a difference in every little corner of the watershed. So there has to be a prioritization effort. So this rule is a big part of supporting prioritizing areas that need more attention. And that attention comes in all kinds of forms. It might be attention from Department of Ag to go out and look at an area, or from DEP to look at the permitting that they have for non-ag BMPs or surface water permits, or for cost share funds that we might have a limited amount every year. So we have this running list that we prioritize this list based on what the data is showing that, areas that need the most assistance based on water quality that would have the greatest impact on getting to the TMDL.
Okay, well, I appreciate it, and you guys are doing a great job. You gals are doing a great job, and I appreciate Dr. Goforth's honest comments. And, I hope that just over time we'll bring the past and the present into a new focus. And I thank you.
Well, if there are no more public questions or comments, we're going to hang around for a while, but we'll be here for a while to do any more discussions or questions that you might have. Thank you for coming, and hopefully you'll be involved in the draft, comments on the draft rules that come out, hopefully end of January, beginning of February. That would be actually the most important time for you to participate. Thank you.